Before we check into today's video, please quickly check below to see if you've subscribed. It's totally free and allows you to never miss one of our stories. The rippling helices of shock space split away as the scabbard of Akora emerged at the edge of the solar system, just beyond the star's gravity well. The vessel was at the head of a 7-starship scouring fleet, and they had come to display their power. Admiral Sevigern sat in his command throne at the bridge, his ancillary feathers twitching at the sides of his head. The scabbard shuddered as its companion ships emerged from shock space in a perfect delta formation. Ideally, this was overkill, but the Overlord had chosen to take precautions. Precautions, care, forethought. This was why the Gathrian primacy was at last poised to take its position on the galactic stage. For countless generations, nearly all of their recorded history, the iridescent-scaled reptiles with feathers running down their heads and spines had been a footnote in the galaxy's encyclopedia of species. Disparate and without unity, the various tribes of the planet Honduras had developed their own cultures and reputations amid the stars. One tribe became renowned as traders, another as experts in agriculture. The Rentoro, however, developed a reputation as military types. The galactic standard for any military was the standing army, assembled professional soldiers trained from youth to be warriors, taught to navigate the battlefield, apply tactics and strategy, and handle all manner of weapons and equipment. This training necessitated that other education must fall by the wayside, and professional soldiers were ill-equipped to do anything else. In the modern days, when proper war was a rarity, these soldiers shipped out to join various peacekeeping forces, hunting pirates, preventing warlords from arising on newly colonized worlds, and acting as first responders for various crises. For generations, the Rentoro had sent their people into the galaxy to serve as pirate killers and space police, until eventually their Primarch had suffered enough indignities. Calling upon old debts of loyalty and blood, Primarch Isivert had recalled nearly every member of Clan Rentoro back to Honduras. It was then that Isivert declared his intentions. For too long had the Gathrians been vagabonds of the stars, begging for scraps from the galactic table. For too long had they been used up and forgotten by an uncaring society that cared nothing for their species. And for too long had the Rentaro used their military power for the benefit of others who cared not if they lived or died. For the next 30 years, Honduras was embroiled in a brutal war. It could not be considered a civil war, as the various Gathrian tribes were not under the auspices of a single government. It was a war of conquest, and the various specialized tribes of Gathrians had no recourse against the military might of the Rentoro. Once the tribes of Honduras were broken and reforged into a single unified mass, the true work began. No longer would the Gathrians be forgotten and exploited. They would use their military traditions for their own benefit. Trade specialities were used to acquire the materials needed, while metallurgists and manufacturers were converted into forges for the war machine. Starships were built, a fleet for the Gathrian people. Isivert did not live to see his dream come to fruition. Isivert's son, who took his father's name to honor his legacy, would ensure that the dream outlived his progenitor. He left his late father with the title of Primarch, and took a new appellation for himself. Overlord Isivert, as the Gathrian leader chose to be known, at last finished forging the Gathrian armada. Each vessel, loaded with naval warriors, was prepared to lay waste to anything in its path. The question then was where to strike. Isivert was not naive. Despite his belief in Gathrian might, he did not believe that his armada could fight the entire galaxy to a standstill. Instead, they needed a sacrifice, a target to destroy that would cow the rest of the galactic community into capitulation. It had to be a conflict that they could win quickly, before alliances could be called upon and an overwhelming force turned on their flank. This meant that the Maverans were out. While it would be satisfying to put those armor-plated birds in their place, The Maverans were one of the most militarily powerful forces in the galaxy, and took pride in their standing military, which regularly patrolled Maveran space, if only to keep up morale. No, it would have to be something else. A species well known but isolated, with many friends but few true allies. A species for whom everyone would notice their loss, but none would be able to intercede. The decision was to target humanity, a choice that Isivert found quite humorous. In a way, the humans were just mammalian versions of the Gathrians, versatile, able to fit into various roles, disparate even without tribal traditions. The humans were traders, diplomats, accountants, techies, and also had quite a presence in the galactic military. What most defined the humans was their resilience. They were able to exist on worlds with widely different climates, their immune systems and heat regulation abilities allowing them to function when other species would find the environment crippling if not lethal. They lived among other species, rarely on their own, simply because their versatility, as a relatively new species in the galactic community, it was easier to immigrate to a pre-established colony rather than wait to found one of their own. Planets that had for generations only known their founding species soon found humans proliferating on their surface. This meant that most people were familiar with humans, knew about them, but might be a bit too annoyed at their diaspora to come rushing to humanity's defense. Another issue in the primacy's favor, and the humans' dismay, was that the humans' homeworld, Earth, was inhospitable to most species. Its climate and conditions changed vastly with the seasons, and each season brought new diseases and disasters. Earth was widely known as a lethal world, and many species had adopted a term from human parlance, the hornet's nest, because everything in there wants to kill you. To the Gathrian primacy, however, there was no goal of settling the planet. If they wanted to, they could eventually rebuild human habitats and arcologies in the wider solar system to take new land, but this was simply a display of power, to force the galaxy to recognize Gathrian power and ensure they were never again taken for granted. And so it came, Admiral Sevigern at the head of the scouring fleet, looking out through the viewscreen to see the quiet beauty of the Sol system. The tiny planet Pluto was currently in their way, its even smaller satellites locked in orbit around the lump of rock and ice. Sevigern ran a taloned hand over his head, smoothing down his feathers. Like most of his species, the Admiral sported blue and green feathers atop his head, and they ran down his spine to his tailbone. Ancillary feathers stuck out to the sides above his eyes, twitching in different positions to display his mood. At the moment, the Admiral found himself trepidatious. Something about this felt too easy, too smooth. The Overlord had often railed about the complacency of the galactic bureaucracy, how it dragged every species down into a morass, wherein each species was locked into a category and could never escape. The Marvans would always be the military poster boys, the Femar would be the face of scientific innovation, and those who moved outside those categories were suppressed. Military might was considered by the galaxy to be unnecessary except in stamping out unapproved actions. The humans, like the Maverns, kept a small fleet to patrol the home system, like some morale-boosting parade. Barely a dozen ships, none bigger than a destroyer. It was a pitiful display in any circumstance. They would be nothing to the scouring fleet. And yet, some primal instinct from aeons past told Sevigern that he was not safe, that even aboard his bridge, surrounded by loyal naval officers and flanked by 6 more vast warships, he was vulnerable. The Admiral had no idea from where this sudden fear originated, but he was determined not to let it show to his officers. Maintaining the facade of quiet contemplation, he let the helmsman take the fleet in closer. The notification of an incoming transmission flashed on Sevigern's command console before the advanced algorithm of an observation platform simply brute-forced the transmission onto the scabbard of Akora's bridge. This is Charon Station. Unidentified vessel, you are in human Confederation space. Identify yourselves, or we will presume hostile intent." The voice that cracked through tried to sound confident, but his voice gave him away. Sevigern allowed himself a smirk. He'd found a kindred spirit. To those on the bridge, the Admiral's smirk was indicative of just what hell they were about to unleash. Finding his voice, the Admiral gave the order. "Wipe that station from existence, then full burn toward Earth. Fire at will on any stations or arcologies on the way." His voice rumbled like the growl of a crocodile, expressing confidence that he did not truly feel. A rolling cheer rose up from the crew, and firing solutions were calculated. Aboard Charon Station, the observers and researchers didn't wait for a response. The moment their transmission did not receive an immediate reply, they leapt to action. "Attention, Naval Command. This is Charon Station. Possible hostile battle group detected. 40 AU. Spinward east-southeast. 7 vessels, at least cruiser class. Refuse to answer hails. Maintaining transmission contact in case of..." The ensign never got to finish his sentence. Several maser turrets angled and flashed crimson, and the station's ablative armor was ripped apart. While a smattering of people would survive the devastation, retreating into shelters, the long-distance communication was cut. The scouring fleet hurled itself earthward, the occasional shot lancing through the blackness of space to pierce human stations along the way. Perhaps the point of this action was to break the human spirit by slaughtering their civilians. Perhaps it was to terrify the galaxy with reports of the atrocity. Sevigern did not know the reason why, but he had been handed his orders, and the Admiral would carry them out. From the moment he understood the meaning of the name with which his parents had saddled him, Lee Enfield had known he would end up as a military man or a staunch pacifist. Now Enfield was a brigadier general in humanity's Terran Defense Force. The Defense Force was segmented into multiple cells that covered the multifarious potential military responses that might be necessitated in stellar warfare. At the time of its creation, many critics had called the TDF an incestuous mess in how it mixed ranks of the Army and Navy, but the nature of space warfare necessitated new roles and behaviors. Currently, Enfield sat in a well-appointed office, currently on rotation for monitoring various activities between Earth, Venus, and Mars. The walls were reinforced plating designed to resemble wood paneling, decorated with thick, red fire-resistant curtains. The desk was large and sturdy enough that a person could shelter beneath it in case of ceiling collapse. The entire office was designed for both form and function, a hallmark of human engineering. For the most part, the TDF was a rather quiet job. Not much shook the galaxy in terms of overall military action, so the Force spent most of its time and resources on training troops to integrate into galactic peacekeeping forces. Pirates were always a threat, after all, and desertions did happen. However, every ranking member of the Terran Defense Force had been trained on what would happen should Earth be attacked. Enfield's breath hitched as a sharp, mostly unfamiliar siren blared from his communication suite. For something this big, he chose to answer it at his console rather than the handheld communicator that nearly all humans carried. Enfield found himself facing a block of text rather than a direct transmission, obviously for time-sensitive matter. From the desk of the Terran Defense Secretary himself, it read thus: "Attention, all Terran Defense Force officers. Earth is under attack. As of 0419 Standard Time, communication with Charon Station was lost while reporting potential hostile contacts entering Sol space. Cronus and Amphitrite stations have likewise been rendered silent. Distribute mobilization orders. Carpenter authorization. Repeat, Carpenter authorization." Brigadier General Lee Enfield only allowed himself a moment to panic. He took a shuddering breath, running his fingers through graying black hair. "Dear God," he rasped to himself. Despite his training, he had never thought Earth would truly come under attack. Enfield took another deep breath, steeled himself, and then his fingers danced across the keyboard to send Carpenter orders down the line to his subordinates. It would be up to them to distribute information and ensure everyone was prepared for the countermeasures. As it stood, Enfield was on rotation for giving orders to the Guardian fleet. He opened direct communication with the Golden Sparrow, the vessel currently heading the Guardian fleet. Appearing on Enfield's screen was the face of Captain Devon Chang, the officer in command of the fleet. Human uniforms shipboard were no longer nearly as bright and showy as they had been in historical times, and Chang sported a drab blue jacket that clung to his outline to ensure full range of motion in the event of boarding action. The sole concessions to old naval style were his officer's hat and the epaulets on his shoulders, both of which showed his ranks 4 bars and 1 star. "General," Chang's greeting started off cordial and became more serious when he saw the expression on the older man's face. Pleasantness dried up in his mouth. "What is it?" Enfield didn't waste time on extraneous words. "Enemy battle group, incoming, spinward, east-southeast. 7 vessels, at least cruiser displacement, but model unidentified. This is the real thing, Captain. I'm sending you what data we have. Buy us whatever time you can." Devon Chang was a proud man, and he made sure to stand even more crisply with his chin jutting forward. "Yes, sir!" Neither Chang nor Enfield had to say more. The Guardian fleet was a token display of military power, there to wrangle any minor problems and to circulate through Sol space for morale purposes. The dozen vessels in the fleet would not have the raw firepower to take on 7 ships of at least cruiser displacement. The Human Confederation built their vessels on the principle of old American destroyers, able to punch well above their weight class, but neither man held any illusions that the Guardian fleet would return home victorious. In the case of a true cosmic miracle, maybe they could win. But the galaxy was an unforgiving place, and rarely rewarded acts of true heroism. The duty now fell to Captain Devon Chang and the other captains of the Guardian fleet to slow the enemy advance as much as possible. Rallying his officers, Chang spread the orders and likewise commanded his communications specialists to relay the information to the rest of the fleet. Once the pertinent knowledge was passed around, Chang ensured the ships were networked together to receive group commands. Normally, they only used these commands for parades, to impress civilians on orbital habitats, but at least those demonstrations kept their skills sharp. "All ships, our purpose is to buy time. Set your engines for silent running, and inch your way toward the incoming hostiles. We need them to waste as much time on travel before we strike, while keeping them out of battery range from Earth. Once contact is made, engage scimitar formation. Hopefully force at least one of them to break off." Scimitar was a variant on an inverted V, meant to trap smaller groups of enemy ships. Since the attackers were likely as unfamiliar with human weapons and doctrine as they were with the attackers, the hope was that the larger ships would still try not to be immobilized and trapped. "Once fire's exchanged, I want Star of Ambition and Fenris Tooth to break off and circle around. We'll use numbers to our advantage. While they're focused on our guns pounding them, you two will go for their engines." In a best-case scenario, they'd hit something vital and cause cascading reactor failure. But even merely disabling an enemy ship's engines would leave it dead in the water. It might still be able to fire on the Guardian fleet, but the ship would no longer be a threat to Earth, at least for the foreseeable future. Admiral Sevigern of the Gathrian Primacy had still been unable to shake that feeling of caution, of facing a predator in the tall grass of primeval Honduras. It had been 2 days since the scouring fleet had entered Sol space. Over time, due to planetary orbits, the fleet had had fewer and fewer civilian outposts upon which to fire. But their primary goal was Earth, and so the fleet did not deviate from its full burn direct course. His officers had also lost track of the humans' parade fleet, the vessels apparently having set themselves for stealth. Outwardly, Sevigern was derisive, saying that it was a good thing, and he didn't want the fleet to be too bored in their extermination of the humans. Inwardly, he was expecting a trap. While they were still too far for perfectly accurate measurements, there was no new major gravity displacement around Earth to indicate that new warships had lifted off of the surface, and likewise no new shockwaves from ships appearing at the edge of Sol space. It all felt too easy. Perhaps the humans really were the workers that many of the galaxy dismissed them as being, only good when they had other species to guide them. That still didn't explain the feeling gnawing at Sevigern's insides. He smoothed out his black uniform, making sure that his silver decorations were still in place. Just as he took his place on the command throne, an officer barked from the front of the bridge. "Admiral, LiDAR has made contact. It's the human fleet." Various wireframes displayed on the screen approximations of the human vessel's shape. Humans built their ships long and shallow, like needles drifting through space. In contrast, the Primacy's Exterminator-class starships were huge, beastly things, broader than they were long, wings swept forward reminiscent of a bird coming in for landing. Clan Rentoro, before the Primacy was formed, was already experimenting with new types of weaponry. The Scouring Fleet was the culmination of that technology. Their primary armaments were various turret-mounted energy weapons along those front-swept wings for broad range of fire. The human ships were all a matte black that helped blend in with the darkness of space, reflecting very little light. As the ships came into range for proper visual contact, Sevigern noted that there were 12 of them in a forward-swept formation, rather like the wings of his own vessel, or a beast intent on clamping its jaws on their throat.
"Broaden our formation,"
Sevigern ordered.
"Don't let them encircle us."
As the exterminators drifted apart from one another, the darkness of space lit up with the bright report of the humans' fangs. Volleyed fire slammed into the Gathrian vessels, calling up worrying telemetry. To borrow a phrase from the humans, these ships hit like freight trains. The blasts carried a startling amount of energy as well as pure kinetic force from the particles therein, and the exterminators' shields were straining after a single exchange. The exterminators had more guns than the human ships, but that led to them being roughly even in initial damage dealt. Sevigern did not like that trade. 2 human destroyers broke off from the middle of the pack, slamming extra power into their engines to dart past the broader exterminator formation. The massive ships flanking them opened fire, eventually shearing through the destroyers' shields and carving deep gouges into their hulls. But the vessels continued onward and then smoothly rotated around.
"Corrupted feast on their eyes,"
Sevigern snarled as the human ships wheeled on his formation's rear, even as their companions opened fire once again. "Admiral, telemetry is coming in. When the human ships fire, their entire hulls light up." Well, that would explain the force with which they struck. The humans had built their ships around their gigantic guns. That also explained the design, packing as much gun into the vessel as possible. But it did not explain how the things were so damnably maneuverable.
"Bring us around,"
Sevigern ordered.
"Relay orders to the fleet to continue destroying the human ships. I will handle the breakaways personally."
More cheers rose up as rotational thrusters kicked on to maximum burn. The exterminators tightened formation, simply to avoid being flanked and picked off by the smaller, scrappier human ships. Again, to Sevigern, it felt like an ancient battle his people would see in the distance, larger predators harried by smaller but more numerous ones. He would not let these mammals bleed him to death. It was an utter fluke when the flower of contemplation was struck from the front and back simultaneously, knocking its shields briefly offline as the human ship's brutal guns overloaded them. What was not a fluke was the advantage that the humans took on their fresh prey. Shots aimed at the wings to tear apart its firepower, while the vessel behind it aimed solely at its engines. Sevigern had originally intended to open fire on both the breakaways at once, but the flower needed his help now. Bringing the exterminator around so all guns could be trained on the small human ship, Sevigern made certain that they were firing at the long side for maximum damage. The scabbard of Akora scored one hit after another, breaking through the shields and beginning to carve holes into the destroyer. The human ship continued firing even as it listed, one cannon lancing into the void, but the other continuing to tear into the flower's belly until finally the vessel went silent, beaten to death by superior Gathrian firepower. "The ship in front!" an officer called, pointing at the destroyer that had been directly abusing the exterminator's front half. "It's no longer firing, but its engines are spooling up. Its reactor is producing more energy than I've yet seen." The human vessel launched forward like the dart it resembled, crashing headlong into the flower of contemplation. Admiral Sevigern understood what was happening just before it occurred, but even if he'd had time to warn his fellow ship, the flower was immobile due to engine damage. The destroyer crashed into its prow, aiming directly for the bridge, engines continuing to blaze as it pushed deeper and deeper into the exterminator's hull. Then, in a blast that briefly disabled sensors, the human ship detonated. It had overloaded its own reactor in a murder-suicide. Or rather, attempted murder-suicide. Gathrian ships were built of sterner stuff. The flower of contemplation no longer had engines or a bridge, but one wing and its gunnery deck remained. While precise shooting was out of the question, the remains of the ship could take pot shots at the human destroyers until their air ran out. Each casualty taken saw the remaining human warships fighting harder, gambling around the exterminators to dart through maser fire and retaliate with those immense crimson lances. Sevigern could not hide the droop of his ancillary feathers. He was concerned, nervous even. One of the 7 exterminators had been disabled and was dying, and 2 more were taking severe damage. The Gathrian ships had been forced to alter their combat methodology, leaving the humans' lance batteries to carve into their hulls because the reactors were now the priority targets. If the humans' guns were broken, they'd simply ram and detonate. Perhaps that had been the plan from the outset, get the scouring fleet afraid of detonation attacks, which would force them to ignore the lances and suffer more wounds as a result. These humans were infuriating opponents. In terms of sheer tonnage and the raw power of the Gathrian vessels compared to the Marvin's finest, it should have been an absolute slaughter, a speed bump at best on their way to Earth. Instead, the scouring fleet was suffering casualties and morale was dropping. The damned things were too fast to ram, so the exterminators could not even utilize their superior bulk properly. Captain Devon Chang could only marvel at what his people could accomplish. The enemy vessels were compact for their mass, displacing like cruisers but packing far more punch, and yet the Guardian fleet was giving as good as they got. It was only the difference in armor and shields that meant attrition was swinging in the enemy's favor. The unidentified hostiles were doing their level best to strike the destroyers from the side, aiming to core out their reactors. Every hull shot, while potentially devastating, afforded their lances the chance to roar one more time. The void around them was becoming a debris field, restricting movement, and that further swung the battle in favor of the aliens. Their enormous vessels could simply crash through the remains of other warships, while the destroyers were simply too light and narrow to afford such impacts. Too late, Chang realized he'd been boxed into a trap. The enemy commander was truly a talented opponent. The last volley of maser fire had been wide, like many of the recent shots, a scattergun approach to catch the swift human ships. But this one, This volley had been calculated. In avoiding the enemy's shots, the Golden Sparrow had been herded into a field of debris. They could try to escape, but the damage was likely to be catastrophic in the process, leaving them to be picked off. No one aboard held illusions that the aliens were there to take prisoners or spare the dying, not after what they had done to the observation platforms and habitats. Adjusting his uniform, briefly doffing his hat to smooth his hair, Devon Chang stared at the view screen with a resolute smile. "Cut power to the Lancers. Redirect to shields and engines. Full burn straight down that beast's gullet. Set the reactor to overload. Ladies and gentlemen," he grinned rakishly, "it's been an honor to serve with you." The Golden Sparrow surged forward with enough engine force that debris behind was scattered wildly. Its prow remained pointed directly at the center of the enemy vessel, expecting that even if the bridge wasn't there, that would deal the most damage. The destroyer aimed straight for the heart of the scabbard of Akora. Admiral Sevigern retaliated, targeting all weapons toward the enemy bridge. The destroyer was too fast for the Gathrians to outmaneuver, so they needed to rely on firepower. He ordered all ahead reverse to afford them any more time to retaliate, and Sevigern even called on other exterminators caught in their own fights to add their firepower lest the Admiral's ship go down. When the bridge was finally breached, Chang still had that same defiant smile on his face. The Golden Sparrow erupted in a nova of energy, searing through the scabbard's shields and frying the vessel's front. The bridge tore open, and roughly a dozen officers were lost to the void before the emergency airlock shields descended. Gasping for air, Sevigern read the incoming reports. This was not good. Scratch that. It was downright awful. The scabbard of Akora was barely functional. Multiple sections unable to communicate except by actual communication transmissions. Wiring must have been fried. Of the mighty extermination fleet, only one other ship remained intact. The indomitable Fury had been barely scratched in that engagement.
"Fury,"
Sevigern began.
"Hold position while we confirm what damage can be repaired aboard the flagship."
As when they had first entered Sol space, a transmission brute-forced its way into Sevigern's bridge. This one included an image. A human male sat behind a heavy desk, clad in a crisp black suit. The thick curtains behind him were blue and green, and at the center, just behind his head, was an enormous logo of a planet bordered by wings, the official seal of the Confederation's government. The man was fairly unremarkable as humans went. His brown hair was cropped relatively short. His eyes were green. His face sported none of the hair that some humans featured, but those eyes were worryingly empty. Admiral Sevigern was reminded of his younger days, when he had been captured and tortured by pirates.
"I'd congratulate you on your victory," the human opened, "but there's really no point. I'm sure that at some time you'd been warned about coming to Earth. I've heard that the other species have adopted one of our own terms to refer to it, the hornet's nest."
The human's mouth stretched sideways slightly. Translation software helpfully identified that as a grimace, though described nothing about its meaning.
"Personally, I've never been fond of the term. Hornets can be industrious, certainly, but they're an invasive and destructive species. I prefer to think of humankind as a similar species, the bee."
"Admiral, the Fury is relaying telemetry," a junior officer interrupted, his outburst utterly ignored by the human. "Their sensors are picking up strange objects that appear and vanish. We don't know what they are." The human kept speaking despite the outburst.
"The bee is industrious, like the wasp. It stings like the wasp. But unlike the wasp, the bee lives in symbiosis with its environment and helps make its surroundings better, healthier. Plants and animals thrive around a beehive." While the human spoke,
reminding Sevigern more and more of his combination interrogator and torturer aboard that pirate ship so long ago. Visual contact finally revealed what the indomitable Fury had been detecting. A legion of smaller craft, shuttles and fighters, and small frigates, some so small as to only house a single pilot and little else. Thousands, tens of thousands. The thing is, wasps will just sting you and that's it. Bees will do so much worse. The myriad of ships dove in, far too small for the remaining weapons to effectively gun down, and too large and heavily armored for point defense to do anything immediately. The craft piled on, outright landing on the Gathrian vessels. Boarding actions were reported. Sevigern bellowed orders for countermeasures. The human kept talking. When there's a threat too large, or one that doesn't respond to stinging, bees will cover the threat. They beat their wings, using pure friction and motion to build up heat. The bees die, but each one that dies is replaced. Their foe, the subject of their ire, is boiled alive in its own blood under the buzzing cacophony. Without communications to tell them just what was happening, Sevigern's crew could only watch as the indomitable Fury suddenly launched escape pods, only to have them gunned down by the surrounding fighters. Not a single one escaped. The craft disembarked from the exterminator and flew well clear before the Fury exploded from an overloaded reactor. You thought that you had stirred the Hornet's nest. You have done something far, far worse. We have identified you as Gathrian. We'll be seeing you soon. Alarms began blaring across the bridge. The reactor had been breached.